They called it the grand Halloween opening of Whispering Pines Estate, a sprawling mansion that seemed to emerge from the mist on a hill just outside town. People had been buzzing about it for weeks. A hauntingly beautiful, newly built Victorian replica with towering spires, creeping ivy, and windows that glinted like knowing eyes. It was the perfect attraction for thrill-seekers looking to test their courage on Halloween night. The moment I stepped onto the lawn, I could feel something off. Maybe it was the cold gust that seemed to whisper right into my ear, or the way the trees around the property appeared to bow in anticipation. There was a heavy, suffocating energy here, like the air itself was thick with secrets and sorrow. "Welcome, friends," boomed the host, a sharply dressed man with a sinister smile that seemed a little too real. "Enter if you dare. But know this, once inside, the doors will lock. You'll only leave when the house decides you're ready." Everyone chuckled, brushing it off as part of the Halloween theatrics. The lights outside dimmed, and one by one, the guests stepped through the massive front doors, disappearing into the darkness. As I crossed the threshold, I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. Then came the deafening click of the door locking behind us, sealing us in. And that's when it began. A low, gut-wrenching moan echoed through the walls, vibrating up from the floorboards and filling the very marrow of our bones. It sounded almost alive. People laughed nervously, assuming it was part of the show. But that laugh quickly turned to gasps as the house began to shake, a faint, ghastly hum turning into a scream so piercing, so full of rage and grief, that it felt like a claw scraping through our minds. Then, without warning, the lights flickered out, and we were plunged into darkness. In the pitch black, the murmurs started, low, confused, and laced with the first hints of real fear. A couple of people pulled out their phones, trying to use the dim light to navigate. Shadows stretched across the room, shifting unnaturally, twisting and turning as if they were alive, breathing in sync with the house's unsettling rhythm. A woman screamed, shrill and panicked. Something touched me. Her voice quivered, and she stumbled back, clutching her arm as though it had been burned. Whispers began rippling through the crowd as more people felt invisible fingers brushing against their necks, their hands. I felt it too, a cold, icy pressure skimming across my shoulder, leaving a prickling sensation behind. A pale, ghostly glow began to illuminate the hallway ahead, leading deeper into the house. It seemed to beckon us forward, drawing us into the very heart of the mansion. Hesitant, we shuffled onward, our collective breaths shallow and anxious. There was nowhere else to go. The entrance was locked tight, and the only option was to follow that ghostly light deeper into the unknown. As we moved, the house began to whisper, soft, mournful voices seeping from the walls, murmuring in a language none of us could understand. The air grew thick with an earthy, ancient smell, like soil mixed with decayed flowers, overpowering and stale. My stomach churned as the whispers grew louder, almost a chant, repeating the same ominous phrase over and over. Ahead, I spotted a massive, ornately carved door standing ajar, the eerie light spilling from inside. Its wood was splintered, as though it had been clawed open from within. Some instinct told me we shouldn't go through, that crossing that threshold would bring us closer to whatever was screaming, to whatever lay beneath the house's polished floors and antique charm. But as we gathered around the door, it swung open wide, creaking with a sound that echoed through the hall like a moan. And that's when we saw it, a room filled with artifacts, old, broken toys, tarnished jewelry, and rusted tools scattered around like offerings. In the center of the room stood a single chair, facing away from us, and on it was a figure wrapped in a long, tattered shawl. Then, just as I thought I could make out a face, the figure moved. The figure in the chair twisted slowly, creaking as if its bones, or perhaps the chair itself, were straining with emotion. A hollow, rasping breath filled the air, and as the figure's face turned into the dim light, I felt my blood turn to ice. It was an old woman, her face pale and gaunt, eyes sunken and black as voids. But those eyes were open, staring right through us as if we were the ghosts, intruding in her world. Her mouth hung slightly open, and from it came a faint, rhythmic whispering, words too mangled to understand. They slithered through the room like smoke, a chant from some forgotten ritual. Someone beside me gasped, and in the silence, it sounded like a shout. The old woman snapped her head toward us, her eyes widening with a sudden, unsettling recognition. Her lips twisted into a terrible grin, showing teeth dark with decay. "Welcome home," she rasped, her voice low and ragged, reverberating through the room. The door behind us slammed shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot, and I felt the walls press closer. Shadows inched along the floor, curling around our ankles like chains. Then the temperature plummeted, a biting cold that sucked the breath right out of us. I could see my own exhaled breath crystallize in the air, hanging in a faint mist before dissipating. Someone behind me yanked at the door, but it wouldn't budge. "Let us out. This isn't funny anymore," they yelled, banging desperately, but the house answered only with a deep, guttural groan that seemed to come from below, like some creature shifting in its sleep. The woman in the chair started to rise, her body folding and cracking, and with each movement, the house let out another shuddering creak, like it was alive and tied to her. Her feet scraped against the floor as she straightened to her full height, towering, more skeletal than human. Her head jerked to one side, and her eyes glowed faintly, like embers smoldering in the dark. Then, just as we thought she might lunge toward us, she reached out a bony hand and pointed down to the wooden floor at her feet. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us, and as I glanced down, I saw something that made my heart hammer in my chest. The wood beneath her chair had started to darken, splitting and cracking open as if something was pushing up from below. A sickening, crunching noise echoed through the room as the floorboards beneath the woman's chair began to split wider, revealing a pitch-black chasm beneath. The cracks spread like veins, weaving outward from her chair and stretching toward us in jagged, splintering lines. From the darkness below came a deep, rhythmic pulsing, almost like the heartbeat of some monstrous creature lying in wait beneath the house. We backed away, eyes locked on the growing chasm, but the walls around us seemed to close in, herding us closer to the widening crack. The air grew thick, suffocating as the cold intensified. My breath hitched as I caught a glimpse of something moving down in that darkness, an arm, pale and shriveled, reaching up as though clawing its way out of a grave. The woman in the chair began to chant louder, her voice growing stronger and stranger, words twisting into sounds that were anything but human. The shadows on the floor slithered toward her, gathering at her feet as if answering her call. They writhed and twisted, forming into human shapes, figures with hollow eyes and stretched, open mouths that emitted silent screams. Each figure was translucent, like smoke caught in the dim light, but the fear in their faces was disturbingly real. A man to my left stumbled, his voice trembling as he whispered, "What? What are those?" He pointed at the shadowy figures, his face pale and slack with horror. "There! Spirits," someone murmured, almost too terrified to speak. "They were trapped here, buried here." The chanting grew louder, a brutal, agonizing sound that pierced our minds, filling us with a sense of dread so intense it felt like our bones would shatter under the weight of it. Then, without warning, the shadow figures moved, their hollow eyes turning to us. They floated closer, mouths still open in silent cries, reaching out as if desperate to pull us down into the dark with them. Panicking, we tried to flee, but every door was locked, every window barred. The woman's voice grew louder, almost triumphant, as she continued her twisted chant. The shadow figures moved faster now, closing in, their fingers inches from our skin, freezing the air with their touch. Then, from the back of the group, someone shrieked, "They're pulling me!" "Help me!" We turned just in time to see him being dragged toward the widening crack, his body half sunken into the floor, as if the wood itself was swallowing him. He clawed at the ground, his fingers scraping against the boards, leaving bloody streaks as he was pulled further down. The house shuddered with a deep, guttural roar, almost like laughter, as the woman in the chair locked her hollow, burning gaze on us. A frantic scramble erupted as everyone tried to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the spreading crack, but the house seemed to move with us, warping to keep us close to that yawning, abyssal hole. The once grand mansion now felt like a sinister, living trap, each wall and floorboard bending and shifting with our every step, guiding us right where it wanted. From the corner of my eye, I saw a young woman near the edge of the crack clutching her chest, gasping as if the air had turned to poison. Her face twisted in agony as she sank to her knees, fingers digging into the floor. I can't breathe," she choked out, eyes wide and terrified. We tried to pull her away, but the house wouldn't let her go. It was as if invisible hands held her in place, pinning her right above the chasm. The chanting grew even louder, the words warping, taking on a mocking, sing-song quality that echoed down every corridor. Suddenly, without warning, the woman's body convulsed, her back arching in a way that no human should bend. She let out a blood-curdling scream that seemed to echo into the depths below, as if answering the house's call. And then she vanished, yanked downward with such force that it left a jagged hole in the floor where she had knelt. A split second of silence followed, and then laughter, low, dark, and dripping with malice, echoed up from the darkness, as if the house itself was delighted by our terror. We bolted down the corridor, hearts pounding, desperate to find any escape. Doors we had passed earlier were now gone, replaced by endless stretches of walls covered in portraits. Each frame held a faded, hollow-eyed face, their expressions twisted with fear and anguish. The figures in the portraits seemed to watch us, their eyes following us down the hall with expressions that grew more pained and frantic as we ran. Ahead, we saw a single door, slightly ajar, spilling out a faint sliver of light. Without thinking, we charged toward it, our footsteps echoing like frantic drumbeats in the oppressive silence. But just as we reached the door, it slammed shut with a brutal finality, and the hallway around us plunged into darkness. The portraits on the walls seemed to shift, their faces distorting, mouths open and silent, agonizing screams. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear anything beyond it, hoping it might lead to a way out. But all I heard was the sound of faint scratching, like nails dragging across wood. It was close, too close, right on the other side of the door. And then, slowly, as if savoring the horror, the scratching grew louder, dragging up and down with a rhythm that matched the sickening pulse of the house. Then came a voice, low and whispery, barely a breath, yet dripping with menace. "You're already home." We stumbled back from the door, huddling together, each of us too terrified to speak. That whisper, "You're already home," hung in the air, dense and chilling, as if it had a weight of its own. The scratching on the other side of the door continued, louder now, relentless, as if whatever was there was trying to claw its way through to us. The portraits along the walls began to change, their faces shifting from muted horror to ghastly, contorted expressions of rage and pain. It was then that I noticed one of the portraits looked eerily familiar. The person in the painting wore clothes just like mine, their face frozen in terror. And in that instant I realized it was me. A surreal, nightmarish version of me, eyes wide with the same fear clawing at my chest. The others noticed their own faces too. Some screamed, some wept, but none of us could look away. It felt as if the house had captured our souls, trapping our terror in these twisted frames. And then, one by one, the faces in the portraits began to speak. "Run! Run while you still can," whispered the distorted version of myself, its lips barely moving, the words like a faint, gasping breath. "She's coming. She's always coming. The walls groaned as if alive, the wood bending and twisting. I turned just in time to see the hallway itself begin to warp, the floorboards stretching and buckling as if something massive was pushing up from below. The moans and creaks intensified, filling the hall with a dark, dreadful rhythm, and suddenly the floor began to split, cracking open along the path we had just taken. Through the splintering wood, we could see shadowy figures rising, their twisted bodies clawing their way up from the darkness. These were no ordinary shadows. They had form, mangled faces, hands outstretched, their eyes hollow and endlessly deep. The spirits of the house, the ones trapped here long before us, coming to reclaim what they believed was rightfully theirs. "Keep moving," I yelled, grabbing the arm of the person beside me, trying to pull them away from the widening crack in the floor. But the house seemed to resist us, the walls warping and stretching, pulling us toward the relentless darkness below. We finally managed to push open a side door, stumbling into what appeared to be a grand dining room, frozen in time. Cobwebs clung to the chandelier above, and the long table was set with ancient, dust-covered plates and goblets, each place setting disturbingly perfect, as if awaiting guests who would never come. An eerie silence filled the room, and as we caught our breath, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The seats around the table were occupied. Each chair held a figure, skeletal and clad in tattered remnants of clothing from decades past. They sat stiffly, hands on the table, their empty eye sockets staring straight ahead. A few had expressions frozen in a hideous parody of welcome, their bony jaws cracked open in unnatural, silent smiles. Before we could process the horror, the door behind us slammed shut, and we heard that familiar, sinister voice again, this time closer, almost whispering into our ears. "Sit. The feast is about to begin." We backed away from the table, eyes wide with horror, but it felt like the room itself was pressing us forward, forcing us to inch closer to those ghastly figures seated around the table. The air was thick and stifling, filled with the scent of decay and something else, something sweet, cloying, almost like rotting flowers. One by one, the dusty goblets began to fill with a thick, dark liquid, pouring up from the bottom as if the table itself was bleeding. The liquid bubbled and frothed, and the faintest whispers rose from each cup, a tortured chorus of voices begging, pleading, whispering secrets that twisted our minds. I turned away, but the voices pulled at my thoughts, each word burrowing into my mind like a curse. The chairs around the table creaked, and with agonizing slowness, the skeletal figures began to move, lifting their goblets in a grotesque mockery of a toast. Their hollow eyes glinted with a strange, malevolent light as they stared at us, as if inviting us, no, commanding us, to join them. I could feel the pull, a dreadful compulsion tugging at my limbs, urging me to sit down. My legs moved of their own accord, and I wasn't the only one. One of the guests, a man in his 30s, stumbled forward, his face pale and slack, his eyes wide and unseeing. He sank into a chair, his hands reaching for a goblet as if in a trance. The moment his fingers touched it, he gasped, his face contorting with a terrible realization. No, this isn't real," he whimpered, but his hands refused to let go of the cup. The liquid began to seep into his skin, darkening his veins, and his eyes rolled back as his body stiffened, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Then he went completely still. Slowly, his skin took on a pallor, and his body seemed to shrink, withering as he slumped back into the chair, a new, permanent addition to the table. Someone screamed, a raw, desperate sound that echoed around the room, but it was cut short as the figures at the table turned their empty eyes toward us, as if deciding who would be next. Their jaws creaked open wider, releasing that terrible stench of rot and decay, and their bony fingers beckoned, reaching out across the table toward us. I felt a cold, invisible grip wrap around my wrist, pulling me forward, and a sickening thought crept into my mind. We weren't guests here. We were offerings. The house had invited us in, luring us with promises of thrills and chills. And now it demanded a price, a tribute of souls. Desperate to break free, I grabbed a nearby candlestick and swung it wildly at the skeletal hand gripping my arm. The bones shattered, scattering across the table, but the rest of the figures only watched, their heads cocked as if in amusement. Just then, the lights flickered, and for a split second, I saw something move in the shadows behind the table, a dark, hulking shape with glowing eyes that burned with an ancient rage. It seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the house, a force older and more malevolent than I could comprehend. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows. The skeletal figures froze, their outstretched hands halting midair, and a voice echoed from the darkness, cold and mocking. "Run, if you think it will help," it said, dripping with contempt. "But remember, every door in this house leads back here." The room's oppressive silence shattered with the voice's final words, and a frantic energy seized us all. We sprinted for the door, barely daring to hope it might open, my heart hammering so loud it drowned out every other thought. As I reached for the handle, it gave way, and the door flung open into a long, dimly lit hallway I was certain hadn't been there before. The hallway was narrow, its walls lined with mirrors that stretched floor to ceiling, reflecting us with unnerving clarity. Each step we took echoed, the sound stretching down the endless corridor. And as we moved, something strange began to happen. Our reflections in the mirrors didn't quite match our movements. They lagged behind or moved too quickly, their faces twisting into expressions that didn't match our own. "Don't look," I whispered to the person beside me, though my own gaze was transfixed. The reflection's eyes followed us, watching with sinister, knowing grins, as if they were waiting for something. Every step forward felt like moving through quicksand, the air thick and heavy, resisting us as we forced ourselves onward. Then came the sound, a faint, dragging noise echoing down the hall behind us, scraping closer with every step. I didn't dare look back, but the others began to whisper, faces pale with terror as they glanced over their shoulders. It's her," someone stammered, their voice barely audible. The dragging grew louder, followed by that awful, wet whisper. "You don't belong here," it crooned, like a lullaby gone horribly wrong. "But you will. Soon." At that moment, one of the mirrors beside me cracked, a thin spiderweb spreading across its surface. And through the splinters, I could see her, the old woman, her skeletal face pressed against the glass from the other side, her eyes blazing with the same fierce, unnatural hunger I'd seen in the dining room. Before any of us could react, she thrust her bony hand through the mirror, the shards falling like glistening razors, and gripped the arm of the person closest to her. He screamed, trying to pull away, but her grip was like iron, dragging him closer as her fingers sank into his flesh, draining the color from his skin. "Help me, please," he shrieked, his voice hoarse with terror, but none of us dared move. We were frozen, rooted in place by sheer horror as she pulled him through the mirror. His scream cut off abruptly as he disappeared into the glass, leaving only a faint smudge of blood on the shattered surface. That was all it took. Panic surged through us, and we tore down the hall, our reflections laughing silently, their mouths twisted in wicked glee. I could hear the old woman's voice again, still singing, still taunting, her raspy voice crawling up my spine. Just ahead, I spotted another door. It looked like a fire exit, and though I knew it was probably another trick, my desperation won out. We threw ourselves at the door, and by some twisted miracle, it burst open. We stumbled into a different room, a parlor, ornate and dimly lit, with a roaring fireplace and walls covered in old, dusty portraits. But as we caught our breath, I noticed something that made my heart plummet. The portraits. They were of us. Each frame held one of our faces, frozen in an expression of pure terror, just like those we'd seen on the walls before. And in each painting, there was something wrong, an arm twisted at an impossible angle, eyes bleeding, faces distorted with agony. As we stood, horrified, the flames in the fireplace flickered, casting shadows that twisted and writhed, and a single, unmistakable voice filled the room, low and mocking. "You're almost ready to join them. Almost. Ready to stay forever." The realization crashed over us like ice water. The house wasn't just trapping us, it was slowly claiming us. Each portrait was a cruel reminder of what awaited, a fate so twisted and permanent that it felt like a nightmare from which we'd never wake. The fire crackled and hissed, throwing shadows that danced along the walls, and with each flicker, the faces in the portraits seemed to shift, twisting further in pain. My own face stared back at me, hollow-eyed and ghastly, and I felt a sickening sense of recognition, like looking into a mirror showing my future. A creaking noise from behind us made us whip around. There, framed by the dim glow of the fire, stood the old woman, her form wavering and indistinct, as if she were a part of the darkness itself. She raised a bony finger, pointing to each of us in turn, her smile stretching wide in that mocking, hollow way. "One by one," she murmured, her voice like sandpaper against bone. "All will be remembered." The air grew colder, and the portrait's eyes seemed to lock onto us, their gazes pulling us in. I could feel the weight of the house pressing down, a physical force bearing on us, pulling us closer to those frames. One of the guests, a young woman near the wall, was yanked toward her portrait, her feet dragging helplessly as if an unseen hand gripped her. "No, please," she cried, clawing at the floor, but the force was relentless. Her face contorted with horror as she was drawn closer, inch by inch, until her nose nearly brushed the glass of her painted likeness. With a final, despairing scream, she was pulled into the frame, her body melting into the canvas, her expression frozen in agony, forever a part of the twisted gallery. A fresh wave of panic tore through us. We backed away from the walls, crowding together, desperate to escape this nightmare. The old woman's laughter filled the room, a sound that reverberated through our bones, sinking deep into our minds. But as her laughter faded, the flames in the fireplace flared, casting light on something we hadn't noticed before. Just above the mantel was an inscription, barely visible under years of dust and decay. The words were faint, but I could just make them out. "Only truth will set you free." Truth? What truth? I muttered, heart pounding as I tried to make sense of it. The old woman's voice slithered through the silence, low and taunting. "The truth of your souls, the secrets you've buried. Offer them to me, and perhaps you might yet escape." The others exchanged panicked glances, their faces twisted in denial and terror. Secrets, our deepest, darkest truths. I could feel the weight of my own buried regrets pressing down on me, threatening to drag me under. One of the guests, a middle-aged man with haunted eyes, stepped forward, trembling. I'll do it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He stared into the flames, his face twisting with anguish as he began to confess, voice choked with guilt. "I betrayed my family, stole everything from them, left them with nothing." As the words left his mouth, a terrible groan shook the house, and his portrait faded, the tortured image vanishing into nothingness. The old woman grinned, her eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. One truth spoken, one soul freed. The rest of us looked at each other, the weight of our secrets pressing down on us, knowing that if we stayed silent, we would become a permanent part of the house. Forever. A terrible silence filled the room, thick with dread. The old woman's gaze bore down on us, expectant and hungry, her eyes gleaming with dark anticipation. We knew the rules now. Only our darkest truths could break the curse binding us to this haunted house. But who would dare speak next? One by one, people began to confess. A young woman wept as she admitted to abandoning her child, leaving him to a life she would never know. An older man stammered through his guilt over a crime long buried, a hit-and run he had never atoned for. With each revelation, the house shuddered, as though it were feasting on the pain and secrets pouring into its walls. And with each confession, another portrait faded, the twisted likenesses dissolving, releasing their occupants from the house's grasp. But not all of us were so brave. Some stayed silent, their lips pressed tightly, eyes darting with fear as they struggled against the urge to speak. I could feel my own secret clawing its way up, a truth I had buried so deep I barely remembered it myself. But the house remembered. It demanded its tribute. The old woman's gaze shifted to me, her bony finger lifting, curling, beckoning me to step forward. I felt my throat tighten, my pulse hammering in my ears as the secret pressed against my mind, unrelenting, insistent. I had spent years hiding it, even from myself. It was the memory I swore I'd take to my grave. I heard someone. I managed my voice cracking. The room spun as the memory flooded back, raw and painful. Someone I cared about. I lied, manipulated them, used them, and I never made it right. The shame burned in my chest, searing through my defenses as the words escaped, each one a piece of me I couldn't reclaim. As the last word left my lips, the house seemed to heave a heavy sigh. My portrait on the wall began to dissolve, the anguished face I'd dreaded becoming forever fading, and I felt a strange, weightless relief, a bittersweet release from the burden of guilt. The old woman's face twisted with frustration as our portraits disappeared, one by one, like dust in the wind. Only a few portraits remained, and those who hadn't confessed began to scream, their faces contorting as the walls themselves seemed to pull them closer. They clawed at the air, voices frantic, but no confession came. The old woman grinned, her skeletal hands reaching toward them as they were dragged back, their faces merging into the frames, their horrified expressions becoming a permanent addition to the house's macabre gallery. For the rest of us, a door opened, a plain, unmarked door we hadn't noticed before. It creaked open to reveal a path outside, leading through a dark, foggy field toward the distant lights of the town. The old woman's voice echoed behind us, a final, sinister whisper. "You may leave, but know this, your secrets are mine now. They will haunt you long after you are free of these walls." We staggered outside, breathing in the cold night air, the house looming behind us like a dark, silent sentinel. I glanced back once, just once, and thought I saw her face in the window, watching, waiting. And as we walked away, the whispers began, faint at first, but growing louder in my mind. Secrets I'd tried to bury, pain I thought I'd left behind, all coming back to me. Because once you give your darkest truths to the house, they never really let you go. I wasn't sure when Lily and I had started drifting apart. Was it when the promotions kept her at work longer? Or maybe when I'd let myself sink into the monotony of my 9 to 5, convinced that routine was what a good husband brought to the table? Either way, the chasm between us felt insurmountable now, and the spark we used to have was reduced to embers buried under years of unspoken frustrations. The camping trip was supposed to fix that, or so I told myself. I'd planned every detail with almost obsessive care, hoping that fresh air and our close-knit group of friends could pull us back from the brink. And for the first day, it worked. We laughed, hiked, shared old stories, and for a few fleeting moments, I caught glimpses of the Lily I'd fallen in love with. It wasn't until the second night, when the alcohol was flowing freely around the campfire, that things started to unravel. It happened fast, almost like a bad punchline to a joke no one wanted to hear. Pete, our notoriously loose-lipped and perpetually drunk friend, leaned over to Lily and slurred, "So, do these woods remind you of your late-night adventures?" The group erupted in laughter, assuming it was just Pete being Pete. But I didn't laugh. I watched Lily's face freeze in a smile that didn't reach her eyes, then flick to me, just for a second, before she brushed it off with a laugh of her own. I tried to let it go, but Pete's words buzzed in my ears like a mosquito I couldn't swat away. Late night adventures? What the hell did that mean? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Later, when the fire had died down and most of the group had turned in for the night, I pulled Lily aside. The crackling tension between us was almost audible. What was Pete talking about? I asked, trying to sound casual, but failing miserably. She rolled her eyes. It's Pete. He's an idiot when he drinks. Don't read into it. But the edge in her voice, the way she avoided my eyes, told me everything I needed to know. She was lying. I didn't push her further, though. I wanted to believe her. God, I needed to believe her. That night, I couldn't sleep. As I lay in our tent, staring at the shadows of tree branches swaying in the moonlight, I heard the faint sound of movement. Lily. She was slipping out of the tent, trying to be quiet. My chest tightened as I debated what to do. Maybe she just needed a pee, I told myself, but something primal urged me to follow her. I grabbed my jacket and crept out after her, my breath visible in the cold night air. I trailed her through the woods, keeping a safe distance, heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw them, her and another man from our group, standing too close, voices hushed. My stomach turned, but before I could confront them, a scream pierced the stillness of the night. It came from deeper in the woods, jagged and primal. For a split second, all three of us froze, the weight of our individual sins evaporating in the face of something much darker. For a moment, none of us moved. The scream echoed in my head, a haunting wail that didn't belong in the realm of late-night camping. It wasn't an animal. It was human, desperate, terrified. Lily turned to the man, Ryan, one of the quieter members of our group, and whispered something I couldn't catch. My fists clenched as I fought the urge to storm over and demand answers. But then Ryan stepped closer to her, his hand brushing her arm in a way that felt too intimate, too practiced. Another scream rang out, closer this time. My gut churned, and I forced myself to shove down the seething betrayal. I wasn't the priority now. Someone was in danger. They heard it too. Lily looked panicked, her hand gripping Ryan's arm like it was the only thing grounding her. I didn't wait to see what they would do. Instead, I pushed forward, moving toward the sound. My boots crunched against the forest floor, loud enough that I knew they'd notice me. Aaron, Lily's voice cut through the night, startled. I didn't stop or turn. Something's wrong. I called over my shoulder. We need to check it out. My pulse was racing, anger and adrenaline battling for dominance. I heard their hurried footsteps following me, though neither said a word. Maybe they were too stunned to argue, or maybe they thought their secret could wait. The forest was dense, the moonlight barely enough to illuminate the narrow path. As we moved, the screams grew fainter, replaced by muffled sobs. I slowed down, trying to orient myself. Then I saw it, a faint glow through the trees. Over there, I whispered, pointing. We crept closer until the source of the light came into view, a clearing bathed in the dim beam of a lantern. At the center, a man was kneeling over a bound figure, his back to us. He was muttering something I couldn't hear, his voice low and guttural. The person on the ground, a woman, was struggling, her wrists tied, a gag muffling her cries. Jesus Christ, Ryan whispered, his voice shaking. Lily stifled a gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. My instinct screamed at me to do something, but my body felt frozen. The scene before us was surreal, like something out of a nightmare. The man stood, turning slightly, and the light hit his face. I recognized him. It was one of the strangers we'd passed earlier on the hiking trail, a guy who'd nodded at us in passing. My stomach dropped. The woman on the ground noticed us. Her eyes widened, and she thrashed harder, trying to draw attention to us. The man followed her gaze, his face twisting into a snarl. Shit, I muttered. Before I could react, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun, aiming it in our direction. Don't move, he barked, his voice cutting through the cold air like a whip. Lily whimpered beside me, and I felt her grip my arm. Ryan raised his hands, his eyes wide with fear. Okay, I said, keeping my hands visible. We're not here to cause trouble. Let's talk about this. The man laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. Talk? You think I want to talk? He waved the gun toward the woman. She thought we could talk too. Look where that got her. Every fiber of my being screamed to act, to stop this. But one wrong move, and he could kill her or us. My mind raced for options, but there were none. We were at his mercy. And then, out of nowhere, Lily stepped forward. What the hell are you doing? I hissed, grabbing her arm, but she shook me off. Please, she said, her voice trembling but steady. You don't have to do this. Let her go, and we'll leave. No one has to know. The man's eyes narrowed, and he tilted his head, considering her. Brave little thing, aren't you? He sneered. What makes you think I'll believe you? You don't have to believe me, she said. But she doesn't deserve this. Whatever she did, this isn't the answer. I wanted to yank her back, but I couldn't. She was right. Our only chance was to de-escalate. But as Lily continued to speak, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. Ryan was inching toward a thick branch lying on the ground, his jaw set with grim determination. Ryan moved slowly, his eyes locked on the man with the gun. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure it would give us away. I didn't dare call out to him. Any sound could set the man off. Lily, oblivious to Ryan's plan, kept talking, her voice soft but unwavering. Think about it, she said. Whatever you're angry about, this won't fix it. You don't have to ruin your life. The man scoffed, the gun trembling slightly in his hand. You don't know a damn thing about my life. Don't stand there and pretend you care. I do care, Lily insisted. I care because I've been where you are, angry, hurt, feeling like there's no other way. But there is. Her words were working, or at least distracting him. His grip on the gun loosened, and he lowered it slightly, his focus shifting to her. It was just enough of an opening. Ryan lunged, the branch swinging in a wide arc. It connected with the man's wrist, and the gun flew out of his hand, landing in the grass. The man howled in pain and turned, throwing a punch that caught Ryan square in the jaw. Ryan! Lily screamed, frozen in place. The two men grappled, fists flying, while the gun lay tantalizingly close but out of reach. I broke out of my paralysis and ran toward it, my hands trembling as I picked it up. It was heavier than I expected, cold and foreign in my grasp. Stop! I shouted, aiming the gun at the man. Let him go, or I swear. He froze, his hands wrapped around Ryan's throat. Ryan's face was turning red, and his struggles were weakening. Drop him, I barked. For a moment, I thought he would ignore me, but then he released Ryan, who crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. The man raised his hands, his lip curling in defiance. Go ahead, do it. You don't have the balls. He was right, I didn't. My hands shook so badly that I was afraid I'd drop the gun. Lily ran to Ryan's side, helping him sit up, her face pale with fear. Get on the ground, I ordered, trying to sound authoritative. He didn't move. Instead, he took a step toward me, his expression daring me to pull the trigger. Don't test me, I shouted, backing up instinctively. Before I could react, he lunged at me, his hand closing over mine, wrestling for control of the gun. We stumbled, and the world spun as I fell backward, the weapon going off with a deafening crack. For a moment, everything was silent except for the ringing in my ears. The man collapsed on top of me, his weight crushing my chest. I pushed him off, scrambling to my feet. Blood seeped from a wound in his side, his eyes wide with shock. You shot me, he rasped. I didn't mean to. I stammered, though it felt like a weak excuse. He clutched his side, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. Lily stared at me, her face a mixture of horror and disbelief. Ryan, still coughing, managed to pull himself upright. The woman on the ground whimpered, her eyes darting between us and the bleeding man. We need to help her, I said, my voice shaky. And him. We need to. He tried to kill us. Ryan snapped, his voice raw with anger. Let him bleed. Ryan, Lily said, her tone sharp. That's not who we are. Not who you are, Ryan muttered. But he didn't argue further. I moved to the woman, untying the ropes that bound her wrists and pulling the gag from her mouth. She gasped, her body trembling violently. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. In the distance, I heard footsteps crunching through the woods. Flashlights bobbed in the darkness, and voices called out. Someone else had heard the gunshot. Help was on the way. The flashlights grew brighter, and voices more distinct, until finally a group of park rangers burst into the clearing, weapons drawn. The sight of their uniforms brought a wave of relief that nearly buckled my knees. "Hands up!" one of them barked, sweeping his light across the scene. I dropped the gun immediately, raising my hands. "It's not what it looks like," I said quickly, stepping away from the wounded man. He was holding her hostage. The rangers fanned out, taking stock of the situation. Two of them approached the injured man, kicking the gun away before checking his wound. Another knelt beside the terrified woman, murmuring reassurances while freeing her legs. The rest kept their weapons trained on us. "It was self-defense," Lily said, her voice cracking. "He had a gun, and he attacked us?" One of the rangers scrutinized us, his eyes narrowing. "We'll sort this out. Everyone stay put." I nodded, too numb to respond. Ryan sat slumped against a tree, still clutching his jaw. Lily stood beside him, her hands shaking as she held a rag to his bleeding lip. No one said a word as the rangers worked, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on all of us. After a few tense minutes, paramedics arrived, rushing to tend to the injured man and the woman he'd tied up. The rangers pulled us aside, separating us to take our statements. I told them everything, how we'd heard the scream, found the scene, and tried to intervene. I didn't gloss over the gunshot, admitting that I'd fired it in the struggle. My voice faltered as I explained, but the ranger taking my statement nodded with a grim understanding. "We'll need to take you back to the station," he said. "This is a serious matter, and we'll need a full report." I expected as much. There was no way we'd just be allowed to walk away from something like this. I glanced at Lily, who was explaining her side of the story to another ranger. Her voice was calm, but I could see the strain in her eyes. Ryan, however, looked furious. When a ranger approached him to ask for his version of events, he barked out a clipped response, glaring at me the entire time. His animosity hung heavy in the air, an unspoken accusation that burned more than I wanted to admit. The paramedics carried the wounded man and the woman out of the clearing on stretchers, the glow of their lanterns fading into the woods. The rangers led us back toward the campsite, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. When we reached the campsite, the rest of the group was waiting, their faces pale with confusion and fear. Pete, now significantly sober, blurted out, "What the hell happened?" "No time for that now," one of the rangers said, holding up a hand. "We're taking them into town for questioning." The group stared as we were led away, their hushed whispers following us into the night. In the ranger station, the harsh fluorescent lights made everything feel more real. They separated us again, interviewing us one by one. Each question was precise, designed to unravel the truth of what had happened. As I sat in the Stark room, recounting the events for what felt like the 100th time, my mind kept circling back to Lily. Her betrayal still loomed large, overshadowing even the chaos of the night. Yet, as much as I wanted to confront her, now wasn't the time. There were bigger things at stake. Hours later, they finally let us go, saying they'd continue the investigation. The man we'd encountered in the woods was in critical condition but stable. The woman he'd kidnapped was recovering and had corroborated our story. When we stepped out into the early morning light, I felt like I could finally breathe again. Ryan muttered something under his breath and stalked off without a word. Lily lingered by my side, her face pale and drawn. "Aaron," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Don't," I said, holding up a hand. "Not now." She looked like she wanted to say more, but I turned and walked away, the weight of the night pressing down on me with every step. The drive home was a blur. My mind was a tangled mess of anger, fear, and disbelief. I couldn't shake the image of Lily with Ryan, her hand on his arm, her whispers in the woods. Then there was the blood, the gunshot, the man's sneer just before he lunged at me. It all swirled together into a storm I couldn't escape. When we pulled into the driveway, Lily and I sat in silence for a moment. I stared at the dashboard, feeling the suffocating weight of everything unsaid between us. Finally, she spoke. "Aaron, I cut her off. Don't. Just don't." She sighed, her voice thick with emotion. "We need to talk about this. About everything." "Oh, now you want to talk?" I snapped, turning to face her. "When Pete made the crack about your late-night adventures, I gave you the chance to come clean. But instead, I had to find out in the middle of the damn woods that you've been sneaking off with Ryan." Her eyes widened, tears welling up. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it to me," I demanded. "What the hell was going on out there?" Lily hesitated, her lips trembling. "It wasn't an affair. I swear. I've been meeting Ryan because I needed someone to talk to. About us." I laughed bitterly. "So you decided the best person to talk to about our marriage was another man? A man from our friend group? No less." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "I didn't know what else to do," she said, her voice breaking. "You've been so distant, Aaron. I felt like I was losing you. And sneaking around with Ryan was your solution?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You lied to me, Lily. You lied, and now I don't know what to believe." Tears streamed down her face as she looked at me, her expression desperate. "I didn't mean for it to get this bad. I just wanted to feel like someone understood me." I shook my head, anger boiling in my chest. "Well, congratulations. Now we're both drowning, and I don't know how the hell we're supposed to fix this." I got out of the car, slamming the door behind me. The fresh air hit me like a slap, but it did little to calm my racing thoughts. Lily stayed in the car, her sobs muffled by the closed door. Inside the house, I collapsed onto the couch, my head in my hands. The adrenaline from the night had worn off, leaving behind a hollow ache. I thought about the woman we'd rescued, the terror in her eyes as we freed her. She'd trusted us to save her, and we'd barely managed to pull it off. And then there was Ryan. The way he looked at Lily, the way he'd been so quick to follow her lead in the woods. Was she telling the truth about their relationship, or was there more she wasn't saying? I wasn't sure what hurt more, the thought of Lily cheating on me, or the possibility that she'd chosen to confide in someone else instead of me. Either way, the foundation of our marriage had been shaken, and I didn't know if it could withstand the cracks. That night, I didn't sleep. I replayed everything over and over, searching for answers that wouldn't come. When morning arrived, I was no closer to understanding what had gone wrong between us or how to fix it. Lily emerged from the bedroom, her eyes red and puffy. She stood in the doorway, her expression a mixture of guilt and determination. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to figure out where we go from here." I nodded slowly, my chest tightening. "Yeah, we do." The next few days passed in a haze. Lily and I avoided each other as much as possible, each retreating to separate corners of the house. The silence between us was suffocating, but neither of us seemed ready to break it. I spent most of my time replaying the events of the camping trip in my head, dissecting every detail, every word, every moment. I couldn't shake the question that had been gnawing at me since that night. Was I complicit in the collapse of our marriage? Had I ignored the warning signs, let resentment fester while convincing myself that things would magically get better? When Lily finally approached me, it was late in the evening. I was sitting on the couch, nursing a beer and staring blankly at the TV. She sat down beside me, her movements hesitant, as though she were approaching a wild animal. "We can't keep living like this," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "No," I agreed, not looking at her. "We can't." She took a deep breath, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of the Lily I'd fallen in love with. The Lily who faced challenges head-on, even when it terrified her. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "For everything. For lying to you, for sneaking around, for letting things get this bad." I turned to look at her, my jaw tight. Why, Ryan? Why couldn't you talk to me? She met my gaze, her eyes brimming with tears. Because I didn't think you'd listen. Every time I tried to bring up how I was feeling, it was like you were somewhere else. Like you'd already decided I wasn't worth the effort. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but deep down, I knew there was truth in what she said. I had withdrawn, hiding behind work and routine, avoiding the hard conversations because they were uncomfortable. That doesn't excuse what you did, I said, my voice harsh. You should have fought for us, Lily. You should have told me the truth. I know, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I was scared that if I told you how unhappy I was, you'd leave. And I didn't want to lose you. I stared at her, the weight of her confession sinking in. For the first time, I saw her not as the woman who had betrayed me, but as someone who was just as lost and scared as I was. It didn't erase the hurt, but it shifted something in me.